Chapter 13. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Read by Kristen Lemoyne. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 13. Heroes, approach! Atrides thus aloud. Stand forth, distinguished from the circling crowd, ye who by skill or manly force may claim your rivals to surpass and merit fame. This cow, worth 20 oxen, is decreed for him who farthest sends the winged reed. Iliad. The name of Ivanhoe was no sooner pronounced than it flew from mouth to mouth with all the celerity with which eagerness could convey and curiosity receive it. It was not long ere it reached the circle of the Prince, whose brow darkened as he heard the news. Looking around him, however, with an air of scorn, "My lords," said he, "and especially you, Sir Prior, what think ye of the doctrine the learned tell us concerning innate attractions and antipathies? Methinks that I felt the presence of my brother's minion, even when I least guessed whom yonder suit of armour enclosed. Front de Bœuf must have prepared to restore his fief of Ivanhoe," said De Bracy, who, having discharged his part honourably in the tournament, had laid his shield and helmet aside, and again mingled with the Prince's retinue. "Ay," answered Waldemar Fitzurse, "this gallant is likely to reclaim the castle and manor which Richard assigned to him, and which your Highness's generosity has since given to Front de Bœuf." "Front de Bœuf," replied John, "is a man more willing to swallow 3 manors, such as Ivanhoe, than to disgorge one of them. For the rest, sirs, I hope none here will deny my right to confer the fiefs of the crown upon the faithful followers who are around me, and ready to perform the usual military service in the room of those who have wandered to foreign countries, and can neither render homage nor service when called upon." The audience were too much interested in the question not to pronounce the Prince's assumed right altogether indubitable. "A generous Prince, a most noble lord, who thus takes upon himself the task of rewarding his faithful followers." Such were the words which burst from the train, expectants all of them of similar grants at the expense of King Richard's followers and favourites, if indeed they had not as yet received such. Prior Aymer also assented to the general proposition, observing, however, that the blessed Jerusalem could not indeed be termed a foreign country. She was communi mater, the mother of all Christians. But he saw not, he declared, how the Knight of Ivanhoe could plead any advantage from this, since he, the Prior, was assured that the Crusaders under Richard had never proceeded much farther than Ascalon, which, as all the world knew, was a town of the Philistines, and entitled to none of the privileges of the Holy City. Waldemar, whose curiosity had led him towards the place where Ivanhoe had fallen to the ground, now returned. "The gallant," said he, "is likely to give your Highness little disturbance, and to leave Front de Bœuf in the quiet possession of his gains. He is severely wounded." "Whatever becomes of him," said Prince John, "he is victor of the day, and were he tenfold our enemy, or the devoted friend of our brother, which is perhaps the same, his wounds must be looked to. Our own physician shall attend him." A stern smile curled the Prince's lip as he spoke. Waldemar Fitzurse hastened to reply that Ivanhoe was already removed from the lists, and in the custody of his friends. "I was somewhat afflicted," he said, "to see the grief of the Queen of Love and Beauty, whose sovereignty of a day this event has changed into mourning. I am not a man to be moved by a woman's lament for her lover, but this same Lady Rowena suppressed her sorrow with such dignity of manner, that it could only be discovered by her folded hands and her tearless eye, which trembled as it remained fixed on the lifeless form before her." "Who is this Lady Rowena?" said Prince John, "of whom we have heard so much?" "A Saxon heiress of large possessions," replied the Prior Aymer. A rose of loveliness and a jewel of wealth, the fairest among 1,000, a bundle of myrrh and a cluster of camphor." "We shall cheer her sorrows," said Prince John, "and amend her blood by wedding her to a Norman. She seems a minor, and must therefore be at our royal disposal in marriage. How sayst thou, De Bracy? What think'st thou of gaining fair lands and livings by wedding a Saxon, after the fashion of the followers of the Conqueror?" "If the lands are to my liking, my lord," answered De Bracy, "it will be hard to displease me with a bride, and deeply will I hold myself bound to your highness for a good deed, which will fulfil all promises made in favour of your servant and vassal." "We will not forget it," said Prince John; "and that we may instantly go to work, command our seneschal presently to order the attendance of the Lady Rowena and her company, that is, the rude churl and her guardian, and the Saxon ox whom the Black Knight struck down in the tournament upon this evening's banquet. De Bigot," he added to his seneschal, "thou wilt word this our second summons so courteously as to gratify the pride of these Saxons, and make it impossible for them again to refuse; although, by the bones of Becket, courtesy to them is casting pearls before the swine." Prince John had proceeded thus far, and was about to give the signal for retiring from the lists, when a small billet was put into his hand. "From whence?" said Prince John, looking at the person by whom it was delivered. "From foreign parts, my lord, but from whence I know not," replied his attendant. "A Frenchman brought it hither, who said he had ridden night and day to put it into the hands of your highness." The Prince looked narrowly at the superscription, and then at the seal, placed so as to secure the flex silk with which the billet was surrounded, and which bore the impression of 3 fleurs-de-lis. John then opened the billet with apparent agitation, which visibly and greatly increased when he had perused the contents, which were expressed in these words: "Take heed to yourself, for the devil is unchained." The Prince turned pale as death, looking first on the earth, and then up to heaven, like a man who has received news that sentence of execution has been passed upon him. Recovering from the first effects of his surprise, he took Waldemar Fitzurse and De Bracy aside, and put the billet into their hands successively. "It means," he added in a faltering voice, "that my brother Richard has obtained his freedom." "This may be false alarm, or a forged letter," said De Bracy. "It is France's own hand and seal," replied John. "It is time, then," said Fitzurse, "to draw our party to a head, either at York or some other centrical place. A few days later, and it will be indeed too late. Your highness must break short this present mummery." "The yeomen and commons," said De Bracy, "must not be dismissed discontented for lack of their share in the sports." "The day," said Waldemar, "is not yet very far spent. Let the archers shoot a few rounds at the target, and the prize be adjudged. This will be an abundant fulfilment of the Prince's promises, so far as this herd of Saxon serfs is concerned." I thank thee, Waldemar," said the Prince. "Thou remindest me, too, that I have a debt to pay to that insolent peasant who yesterday insulted our person. Our banquet also shall go forward tonight as we proposed. Were this my last hour of power, it should be an hour sacred to revenge and to pleasure. Let new cares come with tomorrow's new day." The sound of trumpets soon recalled those spectators who had already begun to leave the field, and proclamation was made, that Prince John, suddenly called by high and peremptory public duties, held himself obliged to discontinue the entertainments of tomorrow's festival. Nevertheless, that, unwilling so many good yeomen should depart without a trial of skill, he was pleased to appoint them, before leaving the ground, presently to execute the competition of archery intended for the morrow. To the best archer a prize was to be awarded, being a bugle horn mounted with silver, and a silken baldric richly ornamented with the medallion of Saint Hubert, the patron of sylvan sport. More than 30 yeomen at first presented themselves as competitors, several of whom were rangers and underkeepers in the royal forests of Needwood and Charnwood. When, however, the archers understood with whom they were to be matched, upwards of 20 withdrew themselves from the contest, unwilling to encounter the dishonour of almost certain defeat. For in those days the skill of each celebrated marksman was as well known for many miles around him, as the qualities of a horse trained at Newmarket are familiar to those who frequent that well-known meeting. The diminished list of competitors for sylvan fame still amounted to 8. Prince John stepped from his royal seat to view more nearly the persons of these chosen yeomen, several of whom wore the royal livery. Having satisfied his curiosity by this investigation, he looked for the object of his resentment, whom he observed standing on the same spot, and with the same composed countenance which he had exhibited upon the preceding day. "Fellow," said Prince John, "I guessed by thy insolent babble that thou wert no true lover of the longbow, and I see thou darest not adventure thy skill among such merry men as stand yonder." "Under favour, sir," replied the yeoman, "I have another reason for refraining to shoot, besides the fearing discomfiture and disgrace." "And what is thy other reason?" said Prince John, who, for some cause which perhaps he could not himself have explained, felt a painful curiosity respecting this individual. "Because," replied the woodsman, "I know not if these yeomen and I are used to shoot at the same marks; and because, moreover, I know not how your Grace might relish the winning of a third prize by one who has unwittingly fallen under your displeasure." Prince John coloured as he put the question. "What is thy name, yeoman?" "Loxley," answered the yeoman. "Then, Loxley," said Prince John, "thou shalt shoot in thy turn when these yeomen have displayed their skill. If thou carriest the prize, I will add to it 20 nobles; but if thou losest it, thou shalt be stripped of thy Lincoln green, and scourged out of the lists with bowstrings, for a wordy and insolent braggart." "And how, if I refuse to shoot on such a wager?" said the yeoman. "Your Grace's power, supported as it is by so many men-at-arms, may indeed easily strip and scourge me, but cannot compel me to bend or to draw my bow." "If thou refusest my fair proffer," said the Prince, "the provost of the lists shall cut thy bowstring, break thy bow and arrows, and expel thee from the presence as a faint-hearted craven." "This is no fair chance you put on me, proud Prince," said the yeoman, "to compel me to peril myself against the best archers of Leicester and Staffordshire, under the penalty of infamy if they should overshoot me. Nevertheless, I will obey your pleasure." "Look to him close, men-at-arms," said Prince John. "His heart is sinking. I am jealous lest he attempt to escape the trial. And do you, good fellows, shoot boldly round. A buck and a butt of wine are ready for your refreshment in yonder tent, when the prize is won." A target was placed at the upper end of the southern avenue which led to the lists. The contending archers took their station in turn at the bottom of the southern access, the distance between that station and the mark allowing full distance for what was called a shot at rovers. The archers, having previously determined by lot their order of precedence, were to shoot each 3 shafts in succession. The sports were regulated by an officer of inferior rank, termed the provost of the games; for the high rank of the marshals of the lists would have been held degraded, had they condescended to superintend the sports of the yeomanry. One by one the archers, stepping forward, delivered their shafts yeomanlike and bravely. Of 24 arrows shot in succession, 10 were fixed in the target, and the others ranged so near it, that, considering the distance of the mark, it was accounted good archery. Of the 10 shafts which hit the target, 2 within the inner ring were shot by Hubert, a forester in the service of Malvoisin, who was accordingly pronounced victorious. "Now, Loxley," said Prince John to the bold yeoman, with a bitter smile, "wilt thou try conclusions with Hubert, or wilt thou yield up bow, baldric, and quiver to the provost of the sports?" "Sith it be no better," said Loxley, "I am content to try my fortune. on condition that when I have shot 2 shafts at yonder mark of Hubert's, he shall be bound to shoot 1 at that which I shall propose." "That is but fair," answered Prince John, "and it shall not be refused thee. If thou dost beat this braggart, Hubert, I will fill the bugle with silver pennies for thee." "A man can do but his best," answered Hubert; "but my grandsire drew a good longbow at Hastings, and I trust not to dishonour his memory." The former target was now removed, and a fresh one of the same size placed in its room. Hubert, who, as victor in the first trial of skill, had the right to shoot first, took his aim with great deliberation, long measuring the distance with his eye, while he held in his hand his bended bow, with the arrow placed on the string. At length he made a step forward, and raising the bow at the full stretch of his left arm, till the centre or grasping place was nigh level with his face, he drew his bowstring to his ear. The arrow whistled through the air, and lighted within the inner ring of the target, but not exactly in the centre. "You have not allowed for the wind, Hubert," said his antagonist, bending his bow, "or that had been a better shot." So saying, and without showing the least anxiety to pause upon his aim, Loxley stepped to the appointed station, and shot his arrow as carelessly in appearance as if he had not even looked at the mark. He was speaking almost at the instant that the shaft left the bowstring, yet it alighted on the target 2 inches nearer to the white spot which marked the centre than that of Hubert. "By the light of heaven," said Prince John to Hubert, "an thou suffer that runagate knave to overcome thee, thou art worthy of the gallows." Hubert had but one set speech for all occasions. "An your highness were to hang me," he said, "a man can do but his best. Nevertheless, my grandsire drew a good bow—" "Foul fiend on thy grandsire and all his generation!" interrupted John. "Shoot, knave, and shoot thy best, or it shall be the worse for thee." Thus exhorted, Hubert resumed his place, and not neglecting the caution which he had received from his adversary, he made the necessary allowance for a very light air of wind, which had just arisen, and shot so successfully that his arrow alighted in the very centre of the target. "A Hubert! A Hubert!" shouted the populace, more interested in a known person than in a stranger. "In the clout! In the clout! A Hubert for ever!" "Thou canst not mend that shot, Loxley," said the Prince with an insulting smile. "I will notch his shaft for him, however," replied Loxley; and letting fly his arrow with a little more precaution than before, it lighted right upon that of his competitor, which it split to shivers. The people who stood around were so astonished at his wonderful dexterity, that they could not even give vent to their surprise in their usual clamour. "This must be the devil, and no man of flesh and blood," whispered the yeomen to each other. "Such archery was never seen since a bow was first bent in Britain." "And now," said Loxley, "I will crave your Grace's permission to plant such a mark as is used in the north country, and welcome every brave yeoman who shall try a shot at it to win a smile from the bonny lass he loves best." He then turned to leave the lists. "Let your guards attend me," he said, "if you please. I go but to cut a rod from the next willow bush." Prince John made a signal that some attendants should follow him in case of his escape, but the cry of "Shame! Shame!" which burst from the multitude, induced him to alter his ungenerous purpose. Loxley returned almost instantly with a willow wand about 6 feet in length, perfectly straight, and rather thicker than a man's thumb. He began to peel this with great composure, observing at the same time, that to ask a good woodsman to shoot at a target so broad as had hitherto been used, was to put shame upon his skill. For his own part, he said, and in the land where he was bred, men would as soon take for their mark King Arthur's Round Table, which held 60 knights around it. A child of 7 years old, he said, might hit yonder target with a heedless shaft. But," added he, walking deliberately to the other end of the lists, and sticking the willow wand upright in the ground, He that hits that rod at 50 yards, I call him an archer fit to bear both bow and quiver before a king, and it were the stout King Richard himself." "My grandsire," said Hubert, "drew a good bow at the battle of Hastings, and never shot such a mark in his life, and neither will I. If this yeoman can cleave that rod, I give him the bucklers, or rather I yield to the devil that is in his jerkin, and not to any human skill. A man can do but his best, and I will not shoot where I am sure to miss. I might as well shoot at the edge of our parson's whittle, or at a wheat straw, or at a sunbeam, as at a twinkling white streak which I can hardly see." "Cowardly dog!" said Prince John. "Sirrah Loxley, do thou shoot; but if thou hittest such a mark, I will say thou art the first man ever did so. However it be, thou shalt not crow over us with a mere show of superior skill." "I will do my best, as Hubert says," answered Locksley. "No man can do more." So saying, he again bent his bow, but on the present occasion looked with attention to his weapon, and changed the string, which he thought was no longer truly round, having been a little frayed by the 2 former shots. He then took his aim with some deliberation, and the multitude awaited the event in breathless silence. The archer vindicated their opinion of his skill. His arrow split the willow rod against which it was aimed. A jubilee of acclamations followed, and even Prince John, in admiration of Locksley's skill, lost for an instant his dislike to his person. "These 20 nobles," he said, "which with the bugle thou hast fairly won, are thine own. We will make them 50, if thou wilt take livery and service with us as a yeoman of our bodyguard, and be near to our person; for never did so strong a hand bend a bow, or so true an eye direct a shaft." "Pardon me, noble Prince," said Locksley, "but I have vowed that if ever I take service, it should be with your royal brother, King Richard. These 20 nobles I leave to Hubert, who has this day drawn as brave a bow as his grandsire did at Hastings. Had his modesty not refused the trial, he would have hit the wand as well as I." Hubert shook his head as he received with reluctance the bounty of the stranger, and Locksley, anxious to escape further observation, mixed with the crowd, and was seen no more. The victorious archer would not perhaps have escaped John's attention so easily, had not that prince had other subjects of anxious and more important meditation pressing upon his mind at that instant. He called upon his chamberlain as he gave the signal for retiring from the lists, and commanded him instantly to gallop to Ashby, and seek out Isaac the Jew. "Tell the dog," he said, "to send me before sundown 2000 crowns. He knows the security, but thou mayst show him this ring for a token. The rest of the money must be paid at York within 6 days. If he neglects, I will have the unbelieving villain's head. Look that thou pass him not on the way, for the circumcised slave was displaying his stolen finery amongst us." So saying, the Prince resumed his horse, and returned to Ashby, the whole crowd breaking up and dispersing upon his retreat. End of chapter 13. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne. greenkri.com. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 14. In rough magnificence arrayed, when ancient chivalry displayed the pomp of her heroic games, and crested chiefs and tissued dames assembled at the clarion's call in some proud castle's high arched hall. Warton. Prince John held his high festival in the castle of Ashby. This was not the same building of which the stately ruins still interest the traveller. and which was erected at a later period by the Lord Hastings, High Chamberlain of England, one of the first victims of the tyranny of Richard III., and yet better known as one of Shakespeare's characters than by his historical fame. The castle and town of Ashby at this time belonged to Roger de Quincy, Earl of Winchester, who during the period of our history was absent in the Holy Land. Prince John, in the meanwhile, occupied his castle, and disposed of his domains without scruple; and seeking at present to dazzle men's eyes by his hospitality and magnificence, had given orders for great preparations, in order to render the banquet as splendid as possible. The purveyors of the Prince, who exercised on this and other occasions the full authority of royalty, had swept the country of all that could be collected which was esteemed fit for their master's table. Guests also were invited in great numbers, and in the necessity in which he then found himself of courting popularity, Prince John had extended his invitation to a few distinguished Saxon and Danish families, as well as to the Norman nobility and gentry of the neighbourhood. However despised and degraded on ordinary occasions, the great numbers of the Anglo-Saxons must necessarily render them formidable in the civil commotions which seemed approaching, and it was an obvious point of policy to secure popularity with their leaders. It was accordingly the Prince's intention, which he for some time maintained, to treat these unwonted guests with a courtesy to which they had been little accustomed. But, although no man with less scruple made his ordinary habits and feelings bend to his interest, it was the misfortune of this Prince that his levity and petulance were perpetually breaking out, and undoing all that had been gained by his previous dissimulation. Of this fickle temper he gave a memorable example in Ireland, when sent thither by his father, Henry II., with the purpose of buying golden opinions of the inhabitants of that new and important acquisition to the English crown. Upon this occasion, the Irish chieftains contended which should first offer to the young Prince their loyal homage and the kiss of peace. But, instead of receiving their salutations with courtesy, John and his petulant attendants could not resist the temptation of pulling the long beards of the Irish chieftains, a conduct which, as might have been expected, was highly resented by these insulted dignitaries, and produced fatal consequences to the English domination in Ireland. It is necessary to keep these inconsistencies of John's character in view, that the reader may understand his conduct during the present evening. In execution of the resolution which he had formed during his cooler moments, Prince John received Cedric and Athelstane with distinguished courtesy, and expressed his disappointment, without resentment, that the indisposition of Rowena was alleged by the former as a reason for her not attending upon his gracious summons. Cedric and Athelstane were both dressed in the ancient Saxon garb, which, although not unhandsome in itself, and in the present instance composed of costly materials, was so remote in shape and appearance from that of the other guests, that Prince John took great credit to himself with Waldemar Fitzurse for refraining from laughter at a sight which the fashion of the day rendered ridiculous. Yet, in the eye of sober judgment, the short close tunic and long mantle of the Saxons was a more graceful as well as a more convenient dress than the garb of the Normans, whose undergarment was a long doublet, so loose as to resemble a shirt or waggoner's frock, covered by a cloak of scanty dimensions, neither fit to defend the wearer from cold or from rain, and the only purpose of which appeared to be to display as much fur, embroidery, and jewellery work as the ingenuity of the tailor could contrive to lay upon it. The Emperor Charlemagne, in whose reign they were first introduced, seems to have been very sensible of the inconveniences arising from the fashion of this garment. "In heaven's name," said he, "to what purpose serve these abridged cloaks? If we are in bed, they are no cover; on horseback, they are no protection from the wind and rain; and when seated, they do not guard our legs from the damp or the frost." Nevertheless, in spite of this imperial objurgation, the short cloaks continued in fashion down to the time of which we treat, and particularly among the princes of the house of Anjou. They were therefore in universal use among Prince John's courtiers, and the long mantle, which formed the upper garment of the Saxons, was held in proportional derision. The guests were seated at a table which groaned under the quantity of good cheer. The numerous cooks who attended on the Prince's progress, having exerted all their art in varying the forms in which the ordinary provisions were served up, had succeeded almost as well as the modern professors of the culinary art in rendering them perfectly unlike their natural appearance. Besides these dishes of domestic origin, there were various delicacies brought from foreign parts, and a quantity of rich pastry, as well as of the simnel bread and wassail cakes, which were only used at the tables of the highest nobility. The banquet was crowned with the richest wines, both foreign and domestic. But, though luxurious, the Norman tables were not generally speaking an intemperate race. While indulging themselves in the pleasures of the table, they aimed at delicacy, but avoided excess, and were apt to attribute gluttony and drunkenness to the vanquished Saxons, as vices peculiar to their inferior station. Prince John, indeed, and those who courted his pleasure by imitating his foibles, were apt to indulge to excess in the pleasures of the trencher and the goblet; and indeed it is well known that his death was occasioned by a surfeit upon peaches and new ale. His conduct, however, was an exception to the general manners of his countrymen. With sly gravity, interrupted only by private signs to each other, the Norman knights and nobles beheld the ruder demeanour of Athelstane and Cedric at a banquet, to the form and fashion of which they were accustomed; and while their manners were thus the subject of sarcastic observation, the untaught Saxons unwittingly transgressed several of the arbitrary rules established for the regulation of society. Now, it is well known that a man may with more impunity be guilty of an actual breach, either of real good breeding or of good morals, than appear ignorant of the most minute point of fashionable etiquette. Thus, Cedric, who dried his hands with a towel, instead of suffering the moisture to exhale by waving them gracefully in the air, incurred more ridicule than his companion Athelstane, when he swallowed to his own single share the whole of a large pasty composed of the most exquisite foreign delicacies, and termed at that time a cowrum pie. When, however, it was discovered, by a serious cross-examination, that the Thane of Königsberg, or Franklin, as the Normans termed him, had no idea what he had been devouring, and that he had taken the contents of the cowrum pie for larks and pigeons, whereas they were in fact bechaficos and nightingales, his ignorance brought him in for an ample share of the ridicule which would have been more justly bestowed on his gluttony. The long feast had at length its end, and while the goblet circulated freely, men talked of the feats of the preceding tournament, of the unknown victor in the archery games, of the Black Knight, whose self-denial had induced him to withdraw from the honours he had won, and of the gallant Ivanhoe, who had so dearly bought the honours of the day. The topics were treated with military frankness, and the jest and laugh went round the hall. The brow of Prince John alone was overclouded during these discussions. Some overpowering care seemed agitating his mind, and it was only when he received occasional hints from his attendants that he seemed to take interest in what was passing around him. On such occasions he would start up, quaff a cup of wine as if to raise his spirits, and then mingle in the conversation by some observation made abruptly or at random. "We drink this beaker," said he, "to the health of Wilfred of Ivanhoe, champion of this passage of arms, and grieve that his wound renders him absent from our board. Let all fill to the pledge, and especially Cedric of Rotherwood, the worthy father of a son so promising." "No, my lord," replied Cedric, standing up, and placing on the table his untasted cup. I yield not the name of son to the disobedient youth, who at once despises my commands, and relinquishes the manners and customs of his fathers." "'Tis impossible," cried Prince John, with well-feigned astonishment, "that so gallant a knight should be an unworthy or disobedient son." "Yet, my lord," answered Cedric, "it is so with this Wilfred. He left my homely dwelling to mingle with the gay nobility of your brother's court, where he learned to do those tricks of horsemanship which you prize so highly. He left it contrary to my wish and command, and in the days of Alfred that would have been termed disobedience, ay, and a crime severely punishable." "Alas!" replied Prince John, with a deep sigh of affected sympathy, "since your son was a follower of my unhappy brother, it need not be enquired where or from whom he learned the lesson of filial disobedience." Thus spake Prince John, wilfully forgetting that all of the sons of Henry II., though no one was free from the charge, he himself had been most distinguished for rebellion and ingratitude to his father. "I think," said he, after a moment's pause, "that my brother proposed to confer upon his favourite the rich manor of Ivanhoe." "He did endow him with it," answered Cedric; "nor is it my least quarrel with my son that he stopped to hold, as a feudal vassal, the very domains which his fathers possessed in free and independent right." "We shall then have your willing sanction, good Cedric," said Prince John, "to confer this fief upon a person whose dignity will not be diminished by holding land of the British crown. Sir Reginald Front de Bœuf," he said, turning towards that baron, "I trust you will so keep the goodly barony of Ivanhoe, that Sir Wilfred shall not incur his father's farther displeasure by again entering upon that fief." "By Saint Anthony," answered the black-browed giant, "I will consent that your highness shall hold me a Saxon, if either Cedric or Wilfred, or the best that ever bore English blood, shall wrench from me the gift with which your highness has graced me." "Whoever shall call thee Saxon, Sir Baron," replied Cedric, offended at a mode of expression by which the Normans frequently expressed their habitual contempt of the English, "will do thee an honour as great as it is undeserved." Front de Bœuf would have replied, but Prince John's petulance and levity got the start. "Assuredly," said he, "my lords, the noble Cedric speaks truth, and his race may claim precedence over us as much in the length of their pedigrees as in the longitude of their cloaks. They go before us indeed in the field, as deer before dogs," said Malvoisin. "And with good right may they go before us, forget not," said the Prior Aymer, "the superior decency and decorum of their manners." "Their singular abstemiousness and temperance," said De Bracy, forgetting the plan which promised him a Saxon bride. "Together with the courage and conduct," said Brian de Bois Guilbert, "by which they distinguished themselves at Hastings and elsewhere." While, with smooth and smiling cheek, the courtiers, each in turn, followed their prince's example, and aimed a shaft of ridicule at Cedric, the face of the Saxon became inflamed with passion, and he glanced his eyes fiercely from one to another, as if the quick succession of so many injuries had prevented his replying to them in turn, or like a baited bull, who, surrounded by his tormentors, is at a loss to choose from among them the immediate object of his revenge. At length he spoke, in a voice half choked with passion, and addressing himself to Prince John as the head and front of the offence which he had received. "Whatever," he said, "have been the follies and vices of our race, a Saxon would have been held niddering (the most emphatic term for abject worthlessness), who should in his own hall, while his own wine cup passed, have treated, or suffered to be treated, an unoffending guest as your highness has this day beheld me used. And whatever was the misfortune of our fathers on the field of Hastings, those may at least be silent." Here he looked at Front de Bœuf and the Templar, "who have within these few hours once and again lost saddle and stirrup before the lance of a Saxon. Begin note about niddering." There was nothing accounted so ignominious among the Saxons as to merit this disgraceful epithet. Even William the Conqueror, hated as he was by them, continued to draw a considerable army of Anglo-Saxons to his standard, by threatening to stigmatize those who stayed at home as niddering. Bartholinus, I think, mentions a similar phrase which had like influence on the Danes. L.T. End of note on niddering. "By my faith, a biting jest," said Prince John. "How like you it, sirs? Our Saxon subjects rise in spirit and courage, become shrewd in wit, and bold in bearing, in these unsettled times. What say ye, my lords? By this good light, I hold it best to take our galleys and return to Normandy in time." "For fear of the Saxons?" said De Bracy, laughing. "We should need no weapon but our hunting spears to bring these boars to bay." "A truce with your raillery, Sir Knights," said Fitzurse, "and it were well," he added, addressing the Prince, "that your Highness should assure the worthy Cedric there is no insult intended him by jests, which must sound but harshly in the ear of a stranger." "Insult?" answered Prince John, resuming his courtesy of demeanour. "I trust it will not be thought that I could mean, or permit any to be offered in my presence. Here, I fill my cup to Cedric himself, since he refuses to pledge his son's health." The cup went round amid the well-dissembled applause of the courtiers, which, however, failed to make the impression on the mind of the Saxon that had been designed. He was not naturally acute of perception, but those too much undervalued his understanding who deemed that this flattering compliment would obliterate the sense of the prior insult. He was silent, however, when the royal page again passed round. "To Sir Athelstane of Königsberg." The knight made his obeisance, and showed his sense of the honour by draining a huge goblet in answer to it. "And now, sirs," said Prince John, who began to be warmed with the wine which he had drank, "having done justice to our Saxon guests, we will pray of them some requital of our courtesy. Worthy Thane," he continued, addressing Cedric, "may we pray you to name to us some Norman whose mention may least sully your mouth, and to wash down with a goblet of wine all bitterness which the sound may leave behind it?" Fitzurse arose while Prince John spoke, and gliding behind the seat of the Saxon, whispered to him not to omit the opportunity of putting an end to unkindness betwixt the two races, by naming Prince John. The Saxon replied not to this politic insinuation, but, rising up, and filling his cup to the brim, he addressed Prince John in these words: "Your Highness has required that I should name a Norman deserving to be remembered at our banquet. This perchance is a hard task, since it calls on the slave to sing the praises of the master. Upon vanquished, while pressed by all the evils of conquest, to sing the praises of the conqueror. Yet I will name a Norman, the first in arms and in place, the best and the noblest of his race. And the lips that shall refuse to pledge me to his well-earned fame, I term false and dishonoured, and will so maintain them with my life. I quaff this goblet to the health of Richard the Lion-hearted." Prince John, who had expected that his own name would have closed the Saxon's speech, started when that of his injured brother was so unexpectedly introduced. He raised mechanically the wine cup to his lips, then instantly set it down, to view the demeanour of the company at this unexpected proposal, which many of them felt it as unsafe to oppose as to comply with. Some of them, ancient and experienced courtiers, closely imitated the example of the Prince himself, raising the goblet to their lips, and again replacing it before them. There were many who, with a more generous feeling, exclaimed, "Long live King Richard, and may he be speedily restored to us!" And some few, among whom were Front de Bœuf and the Templar, in sullen disdain suffered their goblets to stand untasted before them. But no man ventured directly to gainsay a pledge filled to the health of the reigning monarch. Having enjoyed his triumph for about a minute, Cedric said to his companion, "Up, noble Athelstane, we have remained here long enough. since we have requited the hospitable courtesy of Prince John's banquet, those who wish to know further of our rude Saxon manners must henceforth seek us in the homes of our fathers, since we have seen enough of royal banquets, and enough of Norman courtesy." So saying, he arose and left the banqueting room, followed by Athelstane and by several other guests, who, partaking of the Saxon lineage, held themselves insulted by the sarcasms of Prince John and his courtiers. "By the bones of Saint Thomas," said Prince John, as they retreated, "the Saxon churls have borne off the best of the day, and have retreated with triumph." "Conclamatum est, poculatum est," said Prior Aymer. "We have drunk and we have shouted. It were time we left our wine flagons." "The monk hath some fair penitent to shrive to-night, that he is in such a hurry to depart," said De Bracy. "Not so, Sir Knight," replied the Abbot, "but I must move several miles forward this evening upon my homeward journey." "They are breaking up," said the Prince in a whisper to Fitzurse. "Their fears anticipate the event, and this coward Prior is the first to shrink from me." "Fear not, my lord," said Waldemar. "I will show him such reasons as shall induce him to join us when we hold our meeting at York. Sir Prior," he said, "I must speak with you in private before you mount your palfrey." The other guests were now fast dispersing, with the exception of those immediately attached to Prince John's faction and his retinue. "This, then, is the result of your advice," said the Prince, turning an angry countenance upon Fitzurse, "that I should be bearded at my own board by a drunken Saxon churl, and that on the mere sound of my brother's name, men should fall off from me as if I had the leprosy." "Have patience, sir," replied his counsellor. "I might retort your accusation, and blame the inconsiderate levity which foiled my design, and misled your own better judgment. But this is no time for recrimination. De Bracy and I will instantly go among these shuffling cowards, and convince them they have gone too far to recede." "It will be in vain," said Prince John, pacing the apartment with disordered steps, and expressing himself with an agitation to which the wine he had drank partly contributed. "It will be in vain. They have seen the handwriting on the wall. They have marked the paw of the lion in the sand. They have heard his approaching roar shake the wood. Nothing will reanimate their courage." "Would to God," said Fitzurse to Bracy, "that aught could reanimate his own. His brother's very name is an ague to him. Unhappy are the counsellors of a prince, who wants fortitude and perseverance alike in good and in evil." End of chapter 14. 15. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne. greenkri.com. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 15. "And yet he thinks, he thinks I am the tool and servant of his will. Well, let it be. Through all the maze of trouble his plots and base oppression must create, I'll shape myself a way to higher things, and who will say 'tis wrong?" Basil, a Tragedy. No spider ever took more pains to repair the shattered meshes of his web than did Waldemar Fitzurse to reunite and combine the scattered members of Prince John's cabal. Few of these were attached to him from inclination, and none from personal regard. It was therefore necessary that Fitzurse should open to them new prospects of advantage, and remind them of those which they at present enjoyed. To the young and wild nobles he held out the prospect of unpunished license and uncontrolled revelry; to the ambitious that of power, and to the covetous that of increased wealth and extended domains. The leaders of the mercenaries received a donation in gold, an argument the most persuasive to their minds, and without which all others would have proved in vain. promises were still more liberally distributed than money by this active agent; and, in fine, nothing was left undone that could determine the wavering, or animate the disheartened. The return of King Richard he spoke of as an event altogether beyond the reach of probability; yet when he observed, from the doubtful looks and uncertain answers which he received, that this was the apprehension by which the minds of his accomplices were most haunted, he boldly treated that event, should it really take place, as one which ought not to alter their political calculations. "If Richard returns," said Fitzurse, "he returns to enrich his needy and impoverished Crusaders, at the expense of those who did not follow him to the Holy Land. He returns to call to a fearful reckoning those who, during his absence, have done aught that can be construed offence or encroachment upon either the laws of the land or the privileges of the crown. He returns to avenge upon the orders of the Temple and the Hospital the preference which they showed to Philip of France during the wars in the Holy Land. He returns, in fine, to punish as a rebel every adherent of his brother Prince John. Are ye afraid of his power?" continued the artful confidant of that prince. "We acknowledge him a strong and valiant knight, but these are not the days of King Arthur, when a champion could encounter an army. If Richard indeed comes back, it must be alone, unfollowed, unfriended. The bones of his gallant army have whitened the sands of Palestine. The few of his followers who have returned have straggled hither like this Wilfred of Ivanhoe, beggared and broken men. And what talk ye of Richard's right of birth?" he proceeded, in answer to those who objected scruples on that head. "Is Richard's title of primogeniture more decidedly certain than that of Duke Robert of Normandy, the Conqueror's eldest son? And yet William the Red and Henry, his second and third brothers, were successfully preferred to him by the voice of the nation. Robert had every merit which can be pleaded for Richard. He was a bold knight, a good leader, generous to his friends and to the church, and, to crown the whole, a crusader and a conqueror of the Holy Sepulchre. And yet he died a blind and miserable prisoner at the castle of Cardiff, because he opposed himself to the will of the people, who chose that he should not rule over them. It is our right," he said, "to choose from the blood royal the prince who is best qualified to hold the supreme power. That is," said he, correcting himself, "him whose election will best promote the interests of the nobility. In personal qualifications," he added, "it was possible that Prince John might be inferior to his brother Richard, but when it was considered that the latter returned with the sword of vengeance in his hand, while the former held out rewards, immunities, privileges, wealth, and honours, it could not be doubted which was the king whom in wisdom the nobility were called on to support." These and many more arguments, some adapted to the peculiar circumstances of those whom he addressed, had the expected weight with the nobles of Prince John's faction. Most of them consented to attend the proposed meeting at York, for the purpose of making general arrangements for placing the crown upon the head of Prince John. It was late at night when, worn out and exhausted with his various exertions, however gratified with the result, Fitzurse, returning to the castle of Ashby, met with De Bracy, who had exchanged his banqueting garments for a short green kirtle, with hose of the same cloth and colour, a leathern cap or headpiece, a short sword, a horn slung over his shoulder, a long bow in his hand, and a bundle of arrows stuck in his belt. Had Fitzurse met this figure in an outer apartment, he would have passed him without notice, as one of the yeomen of the guard, but finding him in the inner hall, he looked at him with more attention, and recognised the Norman knight in the dress of an English yeoman. "What mummery is this, De Bracy?" said Fitzurse, somewhat angrily. "Is this a time for Christmas gambols and quaint maskings, when the fate of our master Prince John is on the very verge of decision? Why hast thou not been, like me, among these heartless cravens, whom the very name of King Richard terrifies, as it is said to do the children of the Saracens?" "I have been attending to mine own business," answered De Bracy calmly, "as you, Fitzurse, have been minding yours." "I minding my own business!" echoed Waldemar. I have been engaged in that of Prince John, our joint patron." "As if thou hadst any other reason for that, Waldemar," said De Bracy, "than the promotion of thine own individual interest. Come, Fitzurse, we know each other. Ambition is thy pursuit, pleasure is mine, and they become our different ages. Of Prince John thou thinkest as I do, that he is too weak to be a determined monarch, too tyrannical to be an easy monarch, too insolent and presumptuous to be a popular monarch, and too fickle and timid to be long a monarch of any kind. But he is a monarch by whom Fitzurse and De Bracy hope to rise and thrive, and therefore you aid him with your policy, and I with the lances of my free companions." "A hopeful auxiliary," said Fitzurse impatiently. "Playing the fool in the very moment of utter necessity, what on earth dost thou purpose by this absurd disguise at a moment so urgent?" "To get me a wife," answered De Bracy coolly, "after the manner of the tribe of Benjamin." "The tribe of Benjamin?" said Fitzurse, "I comprehend thee not." "Wert thou not in presence yestereven," said De Bracy, "when we heard the Prior Aymer tell us a tale in reply to the romance which was sung by the minstrel? He told how, long since in Palestine, a deadly feud arose between the tribe of Benjamin and the rest of the Israelitish nation, and how they cut to pieces well nigh all the chivalry of that tribe, and how they swore by our blessed Lady that they would not permit those who remained to marry in their lineage, and how they became grieved for their vow, and sent to consult his holiness the Pope how they might be absolved from it, and how, by the advice of the Holy Father, the youth of the tribe of Benjamin carried off from a superb tournament all the ladies who were there present, and thus won them wives without the consent either of their brides or their brides' families." "I have heard the story," said Fitzurse, "though either the Prior or thou has made some singular alterations in date and circumstances." "I tell thee," said De Bracy, "that I mean to purvey me a wife after the fashion of the tribe of Benjamin, which is as much as to say, that in this same equipment I will fall upon that herd of Saxon bullocks, who have this night left the castle, and carry off from them the lovely Rowena." "Art thou mad, De Bracy?" said Fitzurse. "Bethink thee, that though the men be Saxons, they are rich and powerful, and regarded with the more respect by their countrymen, that wealth and honour are but the lot of few of Saxon descent." "And should belong to none," said De Bracy. "The work of the conquest should be completed." "This is no time for it, at least," said Fitzurse. "The approaching crisis renders the favour of the multitude indispensable, and Prince John cannot refuse justice to any one who injures their favourites." "Let him grant it, if he dare," said De Bracy. "He will soon see the difference betwixt the support of such a lusty lot of spears as mine, and that of a heartless mob of Saxon churls. Yet I mean no immediate discovery of myself. Seem I not in this garb as bold a forester as ever blew horn? The blame of the violence shall rest with the outlaws of the Yorkshire forests. I have sure spies on the Saxons' motions. To-night they sleep in the convent of Saint Witol, or Withold, or whatever they call that churl of a Saxon saint at Burton-on-Trent. Next day's march brings them within our reach, and falcon ways we swoop on them at once. Presently after I will appear in mine own shape, play the courteous knight, rescue the unfortunate and afflicted fair one from the hands of the rude ravishers, conduct her to Front de Bœuf's castle, or to Normandy, if it should be necessary, and produce her not again to her kindred, unless she be the bride and dame of Maurice de Bracy." "A marvellously sage plan," said Fitzurse, "and, as I think, not entirely of thine own device. Come, be frank, De Bracy, who aided thee in the invention, and who is to assist in the execution? For, as I think, thine own band lies as far off as York." "Marry, if thou must needs know," said De Bracy, "it was a Templar, Brian de Bois Guilbert, that shaped out the enterprise, which the adventure of the men of Benjamin suggested to me. He is to aid me in the onslaught, and he and his followers will personate the outlaws, from whom my valorous arm is, after changing my garb, to rescue the lady." "By my halidom," said Fitzurse, "the plan was worthy of your united wisdom, And thy prudence, De Bracy, is most especially manifested in the project of leaving the lady in the hands of thy worthy confederate. Thou mayst, I think, succeed in taking her from her Saxon friends, but how wilt thou rescue her afterwards from the clutches of Bois Guilbert seems considerably more doubtful. He is a falcon well accustomed to pounce on a partridge, and to hold his prey fast." "He is a Templar," said De Bracy, "and cannot therefore rival me in my plan of wedding this heiress; and to attempt aught dishonourable against the intended bride of De Bracy, by heaven, were he a whole chapter of his order in his single person, he dared not do me such an injury." "Then, since naught that I can say," said Fitzurse, "will put this folly from thy imagination, for well I know the obstinacy of thy disposition, at least waste as little time as possible. Let not thy folly be lasting as well as untimely." "I tell thee," answered De Bracy, "that it will be the work of a few hours, and I shall be at York, at the head of my daring and valorous fellows, as ready to support any bold design as thy policy can be to form one. But I hear my comrades assembling, and the steeds stamping and neighing in the outer court. Farewell, I go like a true knight to win the smiles of beauty." "Like a true knight?" repeated Fitzurse, looking after him. "Like a fool, I should say, or like a child, who will leave the most serious and needful occupation to chase the down of the thistle that drives past him. But it is with such tools that I must work, and for whose advantage? For that of a prince as unwise as he is profligate, and as likely to be an ungrateful master as he has already proved a rebellious son and an unnatural brother. But he too is but one of the tools with which I labour, and proud as he is, should he presume to separate his interest from mine, this is a secret which he shall soon learn." The meditations of the statesman were here interrupted by the voice of the Prince from an interior apartment, calling out, "Noble Waldemar Fitzurse!" and, with bonnet doffed, the future Chancellor, for to such high preferment did the wily Norman aspire, hastened to receive the orders of the future sovereign. Chapter 15. Chapter 16. Ivanhoe. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Kristen Lemoyne, greenkri.com. Ivanhoe by Sir Walter Scott. Chapter 16. Far in a wild unknown to public view, from youth to age a reverend hermit grew. The moss his bed, the cave his humble cell, his food the fruits, his drink the crystal well. Remote from man, with God he passed his days, prayer all his business, all his pleasure praise. The reader cannot have forgotten that the event of the tournament was decided by the exertions of an unknown knight, whom, on account of the passive and indifferent conduct which he had manifested on the former part of the day, the spectators had entitled Le Noir Fainéant. This knight had left the field abruptly when the victory was achieved, and when he was called upon to receive the reward of his valour, he was nowhere to be found. In the meantime, while summoned by heralds and by trumpets, the knight was holding his course northward, avoiding all frequented paths, and taking the shortest road through the woodlands. He paused for the night at a small hostelry, lying out of the ordinary route, where, however, he obtained from a wandering minstrel news of the event of the tourney. On the next morning the knight departed early, with the intention of making a long journey. The condition of his horse, which he had carefully spared during the preceding morning, being such as enabled him to travel far without the necessity of much repose. Yet his purpose was baffled by the devious paths through which he rode, so that when evening closed upon him, he only found himself on the frontiers of the West Riding of Yorkshire. By this time both horse and man required refreshment, and it became necessary, moreover, to look out for some place in which they might spend the night, which was now fast approaching. The place where the traveller found himself seemed unpropitious for obtaining either shelter or refreshment, and he was likely to be reduced to the usual expedient of knights errant, who, on such occasions, turned their horses to graze, and laid themselves down to meditate on their lady mistress, with an oak tree for a canopy. But the Black Knight either had no mistress to meditate upon, or, being as indifferent in love as he seemed to be in war, was not sufficiently occupied by passionate reflections upon her beauty and cruelty to be able to parry the effects of fatigue and hunger, and suffer love to act as a substitute for the solid comforts of a bed and supper. He felt dissatisfied, therefore, when, looking around, he found himself deeply involved in woods, through which indeed there were many open glades, and some paths, but such as seemed only formed by the numerous herds of cattle which grazed in the forest, or by the animals of chase, and the hunters who made prey of them. The sun, by which the knight had chiefly directed his course, had now sunk behind the Derbyshire hills on his left, and every effort which he might make to pursue his journey was as likely to lead him out of his road as to advance him on his route. After having in vain endeavoured to select the most beaten path, in hopes it might lead to the cottage of some herdsman or the sylvan lodge of a forester, and having repeatedly found himself totally unable to determine on a choice, the knight resolved to trust to the sagacity of his horse, experience having on former occasions made him acquainted with the wonderful talent possessed by these animals for extricating themselves and their riders on such emergencies. The good steed, grievously fatigued with so long a day's journey under a rider cased in mail, had no sooner found, by the slackened reins, that he was abandoned to his own guidance, than he seemed to assume new strength and spirit; and whereas formerly he had scarce replied to the spur otherwise than by a groan, he now, as if proud of the confidence reposed in him, pricked up his ears, and assumed of his own accord a more lively motion. The path which the animal adopted rather turned off from the course pursued by the knight during the day, but as the horse seemed confident in his choice, the rider abandoned himself to his discretion. He was justified by the event, for the footpath soon after appeared a little wider and more worn, and the tinkle of a small bell gave the knight to understand that he was in the vicinity of some chapel or hermitage. Accordingly, he soon reached an open plat of turf, on the opposite side of which a rock, rising abruptly from a gently sloping plain, offered its grey and weather-beaten front to the traveller. Ivy mantled its sides in some places, and in others oaks and holly bushes, whose roots found nourishment in the cliffs of the crag, waved over the precipices below like the plumage of the warrior over his steel helmet, giving grace to that whose chief expression was terror. At the bottom of the rock, and leaning, as it were, against it, was constructed a rude hut, built chiefly of the trunks of trees felled in the neighbouring forest, and secured against the weather by having its crevices stuffed with moss mingled with clay. The stem of a young fir tree lopped off its branches, with a piece of wood tied across near the top, was planted upright by the door as a rude emblem of the Holy Cross. At a little distance on the right hand, a fountain of the purest water trickled out of the rock, and was received in a hollow stone, which labour had formed into a rustic basin. Escaping from thence, the stream murmured down the descent by a channel which his course had long worn, and so wandered through the little plain to lose itself in the neighbouring wood. Beside this fountain were the ruins of a very small chapel, of which the roof had partly fallen in. The building, when entire, had never been above 16 feet long by 12 feet in breadth, and the roof, low in proportion, rested upon 4 concentric arches, which sprung from the 4 corners of the building, each supported upon a short and heavy pillar. The ribs of 2 of these arches remained, though the roof had fallen down betwixt them. Over the others it remained entire. The entrance to this ancient place of devotion was under a very low round arch, ornamented by several courses of that zigzag moulding, resembling shark's teeth, which appears so often in the more ancient Saxon architecture. A belfry rose above the porch on 4 small pillars, within which hung the green and weather-beaten bell, the feeble sounds of which had been some time before heard by the Black Knight. The whole peaceful and quiet scene lay glimmering in twilight before the eyes of the traveller, giving him good assurance of lodging for the night, since it was a special duty of those hermits who dwelt in the woods to exercise hospitality towards benighted or bewildered passengers. Accordingly, the knight took no time to consider minutely the particulars which we have detailed, but, thanking Saint Julian, the patron of travellers, who had sent him good harbourage, he leaped from his horse, and assailed the door of the hermitage with the butt of his lance, in order to arouse attention and gain admittance. It was some time before he obtained any answer, and the reply, when made, was unpropitious. "Pass on, whosoever thou art," was the answer given by a deep hoarse voice from within the hut, "and disturb not the servant of God and Saint Dunstan in his evening devotions." "Worthy father," answered the knight, "here is a poor wanderer bewildered in these woods, who gives thee the opportunity of exercising thy charity and hospitality." "Good brother," replied the inhabitant of the hermitage, "it has pleased Our Lady and Saint Dunstan to destine me for the object of those virtues, instead of the exercise thereof. I have no provisions here which even a dog would share with me, and a horse of any tenderness of nurture would despise my couch. Pass therefore on thy way, and God speed thee." "But how," replied the knight, "is it possible for me to find my way through such a wood as this, when darkness is coming on? I pray you, reverend father, as you are a Christian, to undo your door, and at least point out to me thy road." "And I pray you, good Christian brother," replied the anchorite, "to disturb me no more. You have already interrupted 1 pater, 2 aves, and a credo, which I, miserable sinner that I am, should, according to my vow, have said before moonrise." "The road, the road!" vociferated the knight. "Give me directions for the road, if I am to expect no more from thee." "The road," replied the hermit, "is easy to hit. The path from the wood leads to a morass, and from thence to a ford, which, as the rains have abated, may now be passable. When thou hast crossed the ford, thou wilt take care of thy footing up the left bank, as it is somewhat precipitous, and the path, which hangs over the river, has lately, as I learn, for I seldom leave the duties of my chapel, given way in sundry places. Thou wilt then keep straight forward. A broken path, a precipice, a ford, and a morass!" said the knight, interrupting him. "Sir Hermit, if you were the holiest that ever wore beard or told bead, you shall scarce prevail on me to hold this road to-night. I tell thee, that thou, who livest by the charity of the country, ill deserved as I doubt it is, hast no right to refuse shelter to the wayfarer when in distress. Either open the door quickly, or by the rod I will beat it down and make entry for myself." "Friend wayfarer," replied the hermit, "be not importunate. If thou puttest me to use the carnal weapon in mine own defence, it will be e'en the worse for you." At this moment a distant noise of barking and growling, which the traveller had for some time heard, became extremely loud and furious, and made the knight suppose that the hermit, alarmed by his threat of making forcible entry, had called the dogs, who made this clamour to aid him in his defence, out of some inner recess in which they had been kennelled. Incensed at this preparation on the hermit's part for making good his inhospitable purpose, the knight struck the door so furiously with his foot, that posts as well as staples shook with violence. The anchorite, not caring again to expose his door to a similar shock, now called out aloud, "Patience, patience! Spare thy strength, good traveller, and I will presently undo the door, though it may be my doing so will be little to thy pleasure." The door accordingly was opened, and the hermit, a large, strong built man, in his sackcloth gown and hood, girt with a rope of rushes, stood before the knight. He had in one hand a lighted torch, or link, and in the other a baton of crabtree, so thick and heavy that it might well be termed a club. Two large shaggy dogs, half greyhound, half mastiff, stood ready to rush upon the traveller as soon as the door should be opened; but when the torch glanced upon the lofty crest and golden spurs of the knight who stood without, the hermit, altering probably his original intentions, repressed the rage of his auxiliaries, and changing his tone to a sort of churlish courtesy, invited the knight to enter his hut, making excuse for his unwillingness to open his lodge after sunset, by alleging the multitude of robbers and outlaws who were abroad, and who gave no honour to Our Lady or Saint Dunstan, nor to those holy men who spent life in their service. "The poverty of your cell, good father," said the knight, looking around him, and seeing nothing but a bed of leaves, a crucifix rudely carved in oak, a missal with a rough-hewn table and two stools, and one or two clumsy articles of furniture—"the poverty of your cell should seem a sufficient defence against any risk of thieves, not to mention the aid of two trusty dogs, large and strong enough, I think, to pull down a stag, and of course to match with most men." "The good keeper of the forest," said the hermit, "hath allowed me the use of these animals to protect my solitude until the times shall mend." Having said this, he fixed his torch in a twisted branch of iron which served for a candlestick, and placing the oaken trivet before the embers of the fire, which he refreshed with some dry wood, he placed a stool upon one side of the table, and beckoned to the knight to do the same upon the other. They sat down and gazed with great gravity at each other, each thinking in his heart that he had seldom seen a stronger or more athletic figure than was placed opposite to him. "Reverend hermit," said the knight, after looking long and fixedly at his host, "were it not to interrupt your devout meditations, I would pray to know three things of your holiness. First, where am I to put my horse? Secondly, what can I have for supper? Thirdly, where am I to take up my couch for the night?" "I will reply to you," said the hermit, "with my finger, it being against my rule to speak by words where signs can answer the purpose." So saying, he pointed successively to two corners of the hut. "Your stable," said he, "is there, your bed there, and," reaching down a platter with two handfuls of parched peas upon it from the neighbouring shelf, and placing it upon the table, he added, "your supper is here." The knight shrugged his shoulders, and leaving the hut, brought in his horse, which in the interim he had fastened to a tree, unsaddled him with much attention, and spread upon the steed's weary back his own mantle. The hermit was apparently somewhat moved to compassion by the anxiety as well as address which the stranger displayed in tending his horse; for, muttering something about provender left for the keeper's palfrey, he dragged out of a recess a bundle of forage, which he spread before the knight's charger, and immediately afterwards shook down a quantity of dried fern in the corner which he had assigned for the rider's couch. The knight returned him thanks for his courtesy, and this duty done, both resumed their seats by the table, whereon stood the trencher of peas placed between them. The hermit, after a long grace, which had once been Latin, but of which original language few traces remained, excepting here and there the long rolling termination of some word or phrase, set example to his guest by modestly putting into a very large mouth, furnished with teeth which might have ranked with those of a boar, both in sharpness and whiteness, some 3 or 4 dried peas, a miserable grist, as it seemed, for so large and able a mill. The knight, in order to follow so laudable an example, laid aside his helmet, his corslet, and the greater part of his armour, and showed to the hermit a head, thick curled with yellow hair, high features, blue eyes, remarkably bright and sparkling, a mouth well formed, having an upper lip clothed with mustachoes darker than his hair, and bearing altogether the look of a bold, daring, and enterprising man, with which his strong form well corresponded. The hermit, as if wishing to answer to the confidence of his guest, threw back his cowl, and showed a round bullet head, belonging to a man in the prime of life. His close-shaven crown, surrounded by a circle of stiff curled black hair, had something the appearance of a parish pinfold begirt by its high hedge. The features expressed nothing of monastic austerity, or of ascetic privations. On the contrary, it was a bold, bluff countenance, with broad black eyebrows, a well-turned forehead, and cheeks as round and vermilion as those of a trumpeter, from which descended a long and curly black beard. Such a visage, joined to the brawny form of the holy man, spoke rather of sirloins and haunches than of peas and pulse. This incongruity did not escape the guest. After he had with great difficulty accomplished the mastication of a mouthful of the dried peas, he found it absolutely necessary to request his pious entertainer to furnish him with some liquor, who replied to his request by placing before him a large can of the purest water from the fountain. "It is from the well of St Dunstan," said he, "in which betwixt sun and sun he baptized 500 heathen Danes and Britons, blessed be his name." And applying his black beard to the pitcher, he took a draught much more moderate in quantity than his encomium seemed to warrant. "It seems to me, reverend father," said the knight, "that the small morsels which you eat, together with this holy but somewhat thin beverage, have thriven with you marvellously. You appear a man more fit to win the ram at a wrestling match, or the ring at a bout at quarterstaff, or the bucklers at a sword play, than to linger out your time in this desolate wilderness, saying masses and living upon parched peas and cold water." "Sir Knight," answered the hermit, "your thoughts, like those of the ignorant laity, are according to the flesh. It has pleased Our Lady and my patron saint to bless the pittance to which I restrain myself, even as the pulse and water was blessed to the children Shadrach, Meshech, and Abednego, who drank the same, rather than defile themselves with the wine and meats which were appointed them by the King of the Saracens." "Holy father," said the knight, "upon whose countenance it hath pleased Heaven to work such a miracle, permit a sinful layman to crave thy name?" "Thou mayst call me," answered the hermit, "the Clerk of Copmanhurst, for so I am termed in these parts. They add, it is true, the epithet holy, but I stand not upon that, as being unworthy of such addition. And now, valiant knight, may I pray ye for the name of my honourable guest?" "Truly," said the knight, "Holy Clerk of Copmanhurst, men call me in these parts the Black Knight. Many, sir, add to it the epithet of sluggard, whereby I am no way ambitious to be distinguished." The hermit could scarcely forbear from smiling at his guest's reply. "I see," said he, "Sir Sluggish Knight, that thou art a man of prudence and of counsel; and, moreover, I see that my poor monastic fare likes thee not, accustomed perhaps as thou hast been to the license of courts and of camps, and the luxuries of cities. And now I bethink me, Sir Sluggard, that when the charitable keeper of this forest walk left these dogs for my protection, and also those bundles of forage, he left me also some food, which, being unfit for my use, the very recollection of it has escaped me amid my more weighty meditations." "Dare I be sworn he did so," said the knight. "I was convinced that there was better food in the cell, holy clerk, since you first doffed your cowl. Your keeper is ever a jovial fellow, and none who beheld thy grinders contending with these peas, and thy throat flooded with this ungenial element, could see thee doomed to such horse provender and horse beverage," pointing to the provisions upon the table, "and refrain from mending thy cheer. Let us the keeper's bounty, therefore, without delay." The hermit cast a wistful look upon the knight, in which there was a sort of comic expression of hesitation, as if uncertain how far he should act prudently in trusting his guest. There was, however, as much of bold frankness in the knight's countenance as was possible to be expressed by features. His smile, too, had something in it irresistibly comic, and gave an assurance of faith and loyalty, with which his host could not refrain from sympathizing. After exchanging a mute glance or two, the hermit went to the further side of the hut, and opened a hutch which was concealed with great care and some ingenuity. Out of the recesses of a dark closet, into which this aperture gave admittance, he brought a large pasty, baked in a pewter platter of unusual dimensions. This mighty dish he placed before his guest, who, using his poniard to cut it open, lost no time in making himself acquainted with its contents. "How long is it since the good keeper has been here?" said the knight to his host, after having swallowed several hasty morsels of this reinforcement to the hermit's good cheer. "About 2 months," answered the father hastily. "By the true Lord," answered the knight, "everything in your hermitage is miraculous, holy clerk, for I would have been sworn that the fat buck which furnishes this venison had been running on foot within the week." The hermit was somewhat discountenanced by this observation, and, moreover, he made but a poor figure while gazing on the diminution of the pastry, on which his guest was making desperate inroads. A warfare in which his previous profession of abstinence left him no pretext for joining. "I have been in Palestine, Sir Clerk," said the knight, stopping short of a sudden, "and I bethink me it is a custom there that every host who entertains a guest shall assure him of the wholesomeness of his food by partaking of it along with him. Far be it from me to suspect so holy a man of aught inhospitable. Nevertheless, I will be highly bound to you, would you comply with this Eastern custom." "To ease your unnecessary scruples, Sir Knight, I will for once depart from my rule," replied the hermit; and as there were no forks in those days, his clutches were instantly in the bowels of the pasty. The ice of the ceremony being once broken, it seemed a matter of rivalry between the guest and the entertainer which should display the best appetite; and although the former had probably fasted longest, yet the hermit fairly surpassed him. "Holy clerk," said the knight, when his hunger was appeased, "I would gage my good horse yonder against a zecchin, that the same honest keeper to whom we are obliged for the venison has left thee a stoup of wine, or a runlet of canary, or some such trifle by way of ally to this noble pasty. This would be a circumstance, doubtless, totally unworthy to dwell in the memory of so rigid an anchorite. Yet, I think, were you to search yonder crypt once more, you would find that I am right in my conjecture." The hermit only replied by a grin, and returning to the hutch, he produced a leathern bottle, which might contain about 4 quarts. He also brought forth 2 large drinking cups, made out of the horn of the urus, and hooped with silver. Having made this goodly provision for washing down the supper, he seemed to think no farther ceremonious scruple necessary on his part, but, filling both cups, and saying, in the Saxon fashion, "Veas hael, Sir Sluggish Knight," he emptied his own at a draught. "Drink hael, holy clerk of Copmanhurst," answered the warrior, and did his host reason in a similar brimmer. "Holy clerk," said the stranger, after the first cup was thus swallowed, "I cannot but marvel that a man possessed of such thews and sinews as thine, and who therewithal shows the talent of so goodly a trencherman, should think of abiding by himself in this wilderness. In my judgment, you are fitter to keep a castle or a fort, eating of the fat and drinking of the strong, than to live here upon pulse and water, or even upon the charity of the keeper. At least, were I as thou, I should find myself both disport and plenty out of the king's deer. There is many a goodly herd in these forests, and a buck will never be missed that goes to the use of St Dunstan's chaplain." "Sir Sluggish Knight," replied the clerk, "these are dangerous words, and I pray you to forbear them. I am true hermit to the king and law, and were I to spoil my liege's game, I should be sure of the prison, and my gown saved me not, were in some peril of hanging." "Nevertheless, were I as thou," said the knight, I would take my walk by moonlight, when foresters and keepers were warm in bed, and ever and anon, as I pattered my prayers, I would let fly a shaft among the herds of dun deer that feed in the glades. Resolve me, holy clerk, hast thou never practised such a pastime?" "Friend sluggard," answered the hermit, "thou hast seen all that concern thee of my housekeeping, and something more than he deserves who takes up his quarters by violence. Credit me, it is better to enjoy the good which God sends thee, than to be impertinently curious how it comes. Fill thy cup, and welcome. And do not, I pray thee, by further impertinent inquiries, put me to show that thou couldst hardly have made good thy lodging, had I been earnest to oppose thee." "By my faith," said the knight, "thou makest me more curious than ever. Thou art the most mysterious hermit I ever met, and I will know more of thee ere we part. As for thy threats, know, holy man, thou speakest to one whose trade it is to find out danger wherever it is to be met with." "Sir sluggish knight, I drink to thee," said the hermit, "respecting thy valour much, but deeming wondrous slightly of thy discretion. If thou wilt take equal arms with me, I will give thee, in all friendship and brotherly love, such sufficing penance and complete absolution, that thou shalt not for the next 12 months sin the sin of excess of curiosity." The knight pledged him, and desired him to name his weapons. "There is none," replied the hermit, "from the scissors of Delilah and the 10-penny nail of Jael to the scimitar of Goliath, at which I am not a match for thee. But if I am to make the election, what sayest thou, good friend, to these trinkets?" Thus speaking, he opened another hutch, and took out from it a couple of broadswords and bucklers, such as were used by the yeomanry of the period. The knight, who watched his motions, observed that this second place of concealment was furnished with 2 or 3 good long bows, a crossbow, a bundle of bolts for the latter, and half a dozen sheaves of arrows for the former. A harp, and other matters of very uncanonical appearance, were also visible when this dark recess was opened. "I promise thee, brother clerk," said he, "I will ask thee no more offensive questions. The contents of that cupboard are an answer to all my inquiries, and I see a weapon there." Here he stopped and took out the harp, "on which I would more gladly prove my skill with thee than at the sword and buckler." "I hope, Sir Knight," said the hermit, "thou hast given no good reason for thy surname of the Sluggard. I do promise thee I suspect thee grievously. Nevertheless, thou art my guest, and I will not put thy manhood to the proof without thine own free will. Sit thee down, then, and fill thy cup. Let us drink, sing, and be merry. If thou knowest ever a good lay, thou shalt be welcome to a nook of pasty at Copmanhurst, so long as I deserve the chapel of St Dunstan, which, please God, shall be till I change my grey covering for one of green turf. But come, fill a flagon, for it will crave some time to tune the harp, and naught pitches the voice and sharpens the ear like a cup of wine. For my part, I love to feel the grape at my very finger ends before they make the harp strings tingle." End of chapter 16.